What is up, everyone? I hope you're all good. I have had loads of comments recently regarding feeding, the whats, the wheres, the hows, and everything in between. So I thought it'd be great to make a concise video on as much information as I can get in there. The whats to feed, the where to feed, the when to feed, the how much to feed. Now with all this information, your tank will be cleaner, healthier, happier, hopefully less algae, I suppose that's cleaner, but it will make your fish keeping life easier. So the first question that normally comes up is, how often should I feed my fish? It's probably the most popular one. Well, probably joint first with how much should I feed my fish, but we'll get to that one in a minute. Now you will hear everything from 1 to 2 times a day up to 5 times a day, what they can feed in a minute and what they can eat in 10 minutes. There is no perfect right answer. Everyone's tank is going to be slightly different, so you will have to gear it towards your aquarium. If you've got a massive system with very few fish in it, or you've got an overpowered filter, or you're doing quite a few water changes a week, all this means you're going to be able to get away with a little bit of overfeeding, and you're going to have a bit more wiggle room when it comes to feeding. You can go a little bit sort of heavier without a worry. But as a general rule, I will stick to once or twice a day. They don't really need any more. The more you give them, the more waste it's going to produce in your aquarium, and it also means that they're probably not going to go and find that bit of food that might have floated past them and gone into the rocks or something. They're probably not going to find that because they know in an hour or two's time you're going to come and give them some more. As I said at the start, there is really no right answer to this. You will hear people say, oh, I feed mine every 2 days or every 3 days, and if that works for you, perfectly fine. There's no problems at all. You've got to really keep an eye on your fish. If you know your fish well enough, then you'll see if they're getting skinny. You know, if they've not got nice little rounded bellies, then you know you might need to up your feeding a little bit. But as long as you're paying attention to your tank, you'll be fine. Now, leading on from that, in joint first of the most popular question is probably, how much do I need to feed them? Again, there is really no right answer to this. Everyone's tank is going to be slightly different. Feeding smaller amounts is always going to be the best way. If you feed it and then you go back 5 minutes later and it's all gone and the fish are still looking active, then you can put a little bit more in. Whereas if you put a big handful of pellets in there straight away and it all sinks to the bottom and doesn't get eaten, it's going to be a nightmare for you to go and siphon it or net it out. Yeah, it's just not worth it. So I will always do sort of 2 or 3 little feeds, and it will be a very small amount. What you've got to remember is every time you walk past your aquarium, your fish might or will probably beg for food. Now, if you gave into this, you'd probably feed your tank 10, 15 times a day. And that is not going to be good for the tank, for the fish, and for your sanity, because you are going to have to clean up that mess. Especially in larger, smarter species, things like cichlids and pufferfish and stuff like that, when they get used to you, they are definitely going to be begging. My festive cichlids downstairs, every time I walk past that aquarium, they are there wanting food straight away. Now, for quantities to feed your fish, you will hear lots of different numbers and amounts being thrown around on the internet. Roughly, your fish need anywhere from 1 to 3% of their body weight. Now, what I'd suggest you do is you get a set of scales and you take every fish out and you weigh them, and then you've got to divide that. But no, I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. The easiest way that I've heard and I used to use fairly regularly in the shop is if you have a look at your fish and you have a look at their eye, roughly that's the amount of food that they're going to want, the size of their eyes. So if you're looking at something like the little chili rasboras that are behind me, then they're not going to require a great deal of food. If you put 1 or 2 big pellets in there, they're going to be full instantly, and they might not even be able to eat them. I use this on these guys. So this is Micro Crumb from NT Labs. Now, I don't know if I'm going to be able to get this. That is how small that stuff is. Now that is amazing, because that means that you can really sort of fine tune their food into how much they get, and they absolutely love this stuff. I've been feeding them this for a while now and their reds are really popping and looking really, really good. But that you can gear it down to exactly how much you want to feed when you use a smaller food. Now, another easy way to make sure you're getting the right amount of food into your tank each time, and this is especially if you have children or friends helping out feeding your tank, is to buy yourself a set of measuring spoons. Now, irritatingly, my measuring spoons are downstairs, But I've got a little, I think one's called a drop, one's called a splash, I don't know. I'll link them in the comments or the description if I can. But yeah, they are the smallest little measuring spoons that I could find. I think they're like 1 mil. And those are perfect because, especially, like I say, if you've got children helping you out, you can tell them, you know, 1 scoop of that or 2 scoops of that. Absolutely perfect. That just means then again, they're getting the right amount of food, or what you've decided is the right amount of food, every time, and you know there's nothing to worry about with them being overfed. Now next up is feeding the right foods. Obviously you're not going to be able to sustain a lion on lettuce for the rest of its life, and it's exactly the same for fish. If you feed the wrong foods, you could actually sort of inadvertently be causing yourself problems because they just won't be strong enough to fight off bacteria and parasites and things like that. So it is well worth sort of doing a bit of research into the fish you've got to make sure they've got the right diet. Now, choosing some of these right foods can be easy sometimes. You know, it is as simple as catfish are going to need discus granules, supposedly. Where's my catfish pellets gone? Gone. So, it's as simple sometimes. Can you see my new tank on the screen? I'll stand in front of that. So like I say, sometimes it is as simple as catfish needing sinking catfish pellets, or even algae wafers, depending on the type of catfish that you've got. Both of those are really simple because you know they need to sink. The catfish aren't gonna come up to the surface that often to eat. Some of them do, but not all of them. And you do need to get something down to the bottom for them to graze on. Then you've got your mid-water swimming fish, things like rasboras, barbs, tetras, and they're gonna need either like a floating food or a slowly sinking food so it doesn't disappear into your hardscape and plants before they get a chance to eat it. Now, as I've already touched upon, this is probably gonna need to be size specific. So when you look at it, you've got things like the micro crumb, which is your smallest. Then you can step up to something like this one, nanotropical. So that's that one there. And then you can step up again to your probiotic. Now hopefully I can get this on screen without pouring it on the floor. So you can see the different grades in food there. So you've got tiny fish at the end here, medium, and then a little bit larger. And then you can go larger again. If you've got bigger fish than that, you could even step up to an even larger pellet. Now sometimes you will see a fish taking in food and spitting it back out, taking it in, spitting it out, and that's normally a sign that the food is either a little bit too big for them or a little bit too hard for them. So they're trying to soften it up and break bits off. So again, if you're seeing your fish do this a lot, it might be worth getting a smaller food, a smaller pellet food, or it might even be worth just crushing it up between your fingers and sprinkling it in. Because I mean, hopefully they'll be able to get it and eat it, rather than playing this game of, you know, taking the food in and spitting it back out. It should hopefully make it a little bit easier for them to feed on. Now that sounds all fairly simple, doesn't it? I think we can get on board with that. The one thing that doesn't cover is the dietary sort of requirements, whether they're herbivorous, whether they're omnivores, whether they're carnivores, so on and so on. That's something that I really can't go through in this video. It'd be 4 hours long of going through every single fish and telling you what it feeds on. A little bit of research on the internet is perfect. You should be able to find out exactly if they are more sort of algae-based eaters or whatever, and then you can feed them a diet accordingly. So cichlids, for example, a bit like the festivums that I've got in the tank behind me here, those guys can be anything from some of the smallest shell dwellers that are going to probably want the food that we've already spoken about in the video, all the way through to, you know, big predatory stuff that's going to need pellets and big meaty diet. Obviously the majority of your stuff that you're going to be keeping at home is going to be that medium-sized cichlid. What I find with the festivums here is I feed them a mixture, so I feed them some of the more sort of shrimp-based cichlid 48, so that's a bit more of a meatier sort of based small cichlid pellet, and then I mix in some of the cichlid green 33 every now and again. That just gives them a good varied diet. But for instance, if you were keeping like Mabuna from Lake Malawi, you'd pretty much just be giving them the herbivorous side of it, and maybe every now and again dropping in some other things. It's just working out what your fish need and going along with it, really. One fish that I think is worth mentioning is the suckermouth catfish. So those are always seen as like an algae eater. You know, they eat the glass, they don't eat the glass, that'd be painful. They eat the algae off the glass. A lot of the sucker mouths don't. They actually require a varied diet of sort of more meatier based stuff, and there is so many different species and so many different requirements out there. It's definitely worth checking on which one you've got and what their diet's going to be, because yeah, they might eat some algae wafers every now and again, but you might find that the ones you've got at home require a bit more of a meatier diet, so maybe some of those catfish pellets, or maybe even a frozen food that we'll get onto in a minute. A little tip for feeding as well, and a little thing that I quite like doing, is I've started using the little stick-on tablets again. So those ones just literally, actually, tell you what, they just push to the glass, and the cool thing with these is, what then happens is your fish come to the front and they eat really close to the glass, so you can check them over for any damaged fins, any sort of problems, parasites, anything like that. It gets your fish real up and close and personal, and you can just check what's going on with them. As I already mentioned, frozen foods are a staple for some of the bigger, more predatory fish, or maybe some new fish that you've just got in. Maybe they're wild caught and they've not started accepting pellets yet. Frozen foods are a really good way of getting them to start off food. Your ultimate goal should be getting them onto pelleted food and dry foods, because personally I just find them much better. They're easier to feed, the nutritional values of them are normally better, but yeah, that's just my personal preference on it. But feeding things like frozen foods and vegetables once a week or so is a really good treat for the fish. Another question that gets asked is, when should I feed my fish? Well, there isn't really necessarily a correct time to feed your fish, but there are probably a few times to avoid and a few times to look at, depending on what fish you've got. One thing I would avoid is just as your lights turn on, going and feeding them straight away. Really, the fish haven't had time to wake up. You might find a lot of that food ends up getting in amongst the plants, in amongst the hardscape, and just ends up sort of breaking down and causing a bit of a pollution issue by just the fish not realising it's there. I'd always give them a bit of time to wake up before really going and feeding them. A similar thing can be said for when the lights are about to turn off, but there are exceptions to that rule that you would possibly want to feed when the lights are off. So I'll get into that in just a couple of seconds. But for the majority of your fish, once the lights have been on for a few hours, you should be absolutely golden and you should be okay to feed them. As long as they're swimming about and they look like they're active, they'll be fine. So the exception to the rule that I was talking about are things like your catfishes, your loaches, things that are a little bit more, I suppose, nocturnal than a lot of your swimmy fish, like your tetras and rasboras. Some of those catfish won't come out during the day, or at least won't come out bravely during the day. They may come out and then they'll disappear back in. So it may be worth putting in some food just as the lights are going out. Now, I doubt I'll get them on camera, but in this tank behind me, there's some South American bumblebee catfish that do appear every now and again during the day, but there is 6 of them in here, and I probably see 1 or 2 at a time, maybe. There are also some clown plecos in here that, again, don't often appear during the day. So what I'll normally do is, just as the lights are starting to dim, I'll pop in maybe a couple of algae wafers or some catfish pellets or a little bit of frozen food just around the rock work, not overdoing it, because obviously it can cause issues if they don't find it, but most of the time it's gone by morning. So doing that once a week or so, if you've got those fish that you're worried about eating, should be absolutely fine. Hopefully you found it useful, and hopefully it will make your tank a cleaner, easier, more manageable place in the future. Fingers crossed. I'm actually just going to sit here and watch these guys tear into this stick-on tablet, because I just watched a Kaiberzi like wrap his mouth totally around the tablet. So if I can get that on camera, I'll put it just after this segment so you guys can see it, but they are going crazy for it. So yeah, I'm going to sit and watch this for a bit. I'll see you in the next one.